Somewhere in the backwoods of Tennessee, a baby cries inside a one-room cabin. Her mother, Easter, is a young enslaved woman, barely free herself from the afterpains of labor, her body sore, her dignity long gone, but when she looks down at her newborn daughter, something rises in her spirit. In a place full of misery and degradation, maybe it was a small glimpse of joy. She managed to whisper a name. Princess. Maybe it was the closest thing to a dream she could give her child, something soft, something royal, something safe. But then the door opens, and her owner steps in, James Jackson III, the white man who fathered the child but wouldn't dare claim her. He flips open the ledger, dips his pen in ink, and says, without a trace of emotion, yet a smirk, "We'll call her Queen." Not because he believed she was royal, not because he loved her, but because he could. Because it was funny to him. Because naming an enslaved, half-black baby Queen was his way of spitting in her face without ever raising a hand. And he made sure the pen scratched her name into history, but he left one column blank. Father, unknown. And just like that, Queen Jackson Haley was born, not with a crown, not to a throne, but to chains, silence, and a name that mocked her every being. And this was not rare. Throughout the American South, enslaved babies were given names like Caesar, Venus, or Moses, not out of honor but humiliation. Names were psychological weapons. They weren't given, they were imposed. And if you think the damage stopped at the plantation, keep watching. Queen Haley was born into slavery in Alabama, the daughter of a white plantation owner named Jas Jackson and an enslaved woman named Easter. Her light skin set her apart, too white to be fully accepted by the enslaved community, and too black to ever belong to the white world. Isolated on both sides, Queen tried to survive the only way she knew how. At times, she used her mixed heritage to place herself above darker-skinned enslaved people, hoping it might protect her. But those attempts only deepened her loneliness. After freedom, Queen struggled to find stability. She worked as a servant and, at times, as a prostitute, doing whatever she had to in order to stay alive in a world that gave her few options. Before meeting Alec Haley, she had a son under difficult circumstances. Later, she and Alec started a new chapter together and had another son, Simon Haley. Simon became a college professor, and he would have a son that would one day share their family story with the world. His name would be Alex Haley. The name Queen may have started as a cruel joke, meant to mock rather than honor. But over time, through her survival, her family's achievements, and her grandson's writing, it became something more. Today, Queen Haley's name stands as a symbol of endurance and a reminder of the complicated choices Black women were forced to make to survive. But Queen wasn't alone. Across the South, enslaved people were given names that sounded powerful or royal, names that were meant to mock them, not honor them. Chapter 2 looks closer at the meaning behind these names and what they were really designed to do. In the 1700s and 1800s, slave ledgers and inventories often listed classical names tied to power or antiquity. The practice of giving enslaved people grand, regal, or biblical names like King, Caesar, Moses, or even Venus wasn't just common, it was calculated. On paper, these names sounded powerful. But in reality, they were often assigned to men and women who had no rights, no autonomy, and no say in their own lives. It was one of the earliest tools of psychological control in the American slavery system, naming your property as if it were royal just to remind it that it wasn't. To call a man Caesar while he worked in chains was not a compliment. Names like Moses weren't meant to honor the biblical liberator. They were meant to mock the idea of escape altogether, because in the eyes of their owners, there was no promised land coming. And while most enslaved people were recorded under common names like Mary, Ben, Nancy, etc., every so often, a name like Queen or Caesar or even Aphrodite would appear, a cruel, symbolic choice. Here are a few real-life examples of enslaved people with extravagant names used in irony and mockery. Moses Stafford of the University of Alabama. On January 3, 1845, 28-year-old Moses Stafford was enslaved directly by the University of Alabama. He was purchased for exactly $700. He was a skilled laborer, plastering walls, building observatory platforms, repairing dorms, and even constructing a dredging machine for river work. Moses worked alongside other enslaved carpenters named William and Willis, and another unnamed enslaved boy to finish the newly constructed Jefferson Building in December of 1851. There are several Caesars who were enslaved but played important roles despite their dehumanization. Simply Caesar. This Caesar is particularly special because he was among the earliest born humans ever photographed in 1851 and was the last enslaved person manumitted to buy his own freedom in New York. He lived into his 100s and witnessed generations of enslavement and subtle emancipation shifts that he wouldn't get to benefit from. Then there's Caesar Robbins of Massachusetts. Caesar Robbins was born into slavery in Massachusetts around 1745. He fought in both the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, though his enslaver often claimed his pay. After gaining his freedom, Robbins became a farmer and established his own household. His family continued to fight for freedom, with his descendants becoming active in the abolitionist movement. The Robbins House in Concord, Massachusetts, still standing today, honors that legacy and the journey from bondage to activism. Then there's Negro Caesar. In 1792, in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, an enslaved man also named Caesar, but called by his captors Negro Caesar, appeared in a Pennsylvania property record. What made it unusual is that he had a will and an estate settled after his death. That kind of documentation was rare for someone enslaved. This wealth of detail, including naming, property, heirs, and executors, reveals a man who somehow had legal standing in his societal condition. His name is one of the few details that survive about his life. And then there were the other extravagant names given to the enslaved, who were looked down upon. In North Carolina, a woman named Venus Vance, also known as Mammy Venus, was enslaved by the Vance family. After the death of her enslaver in 1844, she was sold back to her former enslaver for only $1. Historians believe the symbolic price reflected the view that she no longer held economic value. But Venus Vance held a lot of value whether it was forced or not. Venus helped raise and was the caretaker for Zebulon Vance, who would go on to become governor of North Carolina, and his brother, Robert B. Vance, a U.S. congressman. Their power was built on her labor, and her presence, her name, only recorded in withered ledgers. And certain areas of the country went even further or darker with the naming cruelty. Mainly in South Carolina, plantation records show enslaved children named Zeus and Aphrodite. These names, pulled from classical mythology, weren't signs of admiration. In some cases, like Aphrodite, the intent was sexualized degradation. Aphrodite was considered the goddess of love, but when it was used there in South Carolina, her name was in reference of prostitution, basically calling these little girls baby, prostitutes. These names did more than mock. They severed people from their own histories, breaking the link to languages and identities they once knew. In Chapter 3, we look at what it meant to lose those original names and how that loss echoed through generations. The question is, what were our names before interference? Because before they were called Caesar, before they were Queen, Venus, or Moses, they had other names. Names spoken in languages we were never taught. Names whispered during births, shouted during rituals, sung during harvests. Those names had roots, tribes, totems, ancestors, meanings. But the moment the ships docked and the auctions began, they were gone. The names weren't just replaced, they were erased. It wasn't enough to steal a person's body. They had to steal their identity too. Men named Babatunde became Thomas. Women named Abina became Mary. Children born with names older than any plantation were rebranded like cattle. In West African cultures, names carry spirit and prophecy. A name can describe the day you were born, the God you descend from, your family's role in the village, or your destiny. A name could speak your power before you even spoke a word. So to rip that away and replace it with a Jenny or an Lewis was more than cruelty. It was cultural genocide. The most famous fictional example of this kind of erasure comes from Alex Haley's Roots. The character Kunta Kinte, based on Haley's claimed ancestor, is whipped until he answers to the name Toby. While the story had a massive cultural impact, Haley later admitted that parts of Roots were borrowed from another novel, The African by Harold Corlander. Even so, the scene struck a nerve because for many it felt emotionally true. It reflected a real pattern. To break someone, you start by breaking their name, and we'll never know most of those names. They didn't make it into the ledgers or carved on tombstones. They vanished into the silence between slave ship planks. What we have left is the question: what were we called before they told us who to be? The owners thought they erased it all, the names, the gods, the tribes, the languages. But they didn't know what we hid in the dark. They didn't hear the names we kept alive in secret. They didn't see the symbols we etched into wood, dirt, and skin. They couldn't decode the chants, the call and response, the braided maps in our daughter's hair. But even without the original names, we found ways to hold on to identity. We adapted our worship. Call and response chants and polyrhythms echoed ancestral rhythms disguised in Christian hymns. What sounded like prayer was coded memory. In the Sea Islands, isolated communities kept more than hope alive. It was there where the Gullah people formed their own naming styles, mixing African and English elements. Some names carried sounds or roots tied to Mende, Yoruba, or Kikongo traditions. Others created pet names or praise names of private names only to be used inside the family. And when that wasn't possible, we still resisted in other ways. Through code, through Tutnese language, through rhythm, song, and dance. So it is true that not every name survived, but identity, that's harder to kill. After emancipation, Black Americans needed surnames to exist in a legal system that had only ever counted them as property. Formerly enslaved people had to figure out how to live in a society that had never recognized them as human beings, let alone citizens. One of the first requirements was to choose a surname. To keep things simple, many kept the names of former enslavers because those were already used in records and legal documents. Others chose new names as a way, however limited, to mark a new chapter for themselves. Some picked names like Freeman or Strong as small statements of independence, to say I am a free man or I am strong. Others took the names of respected figures like Washington or Lincoln, hoping it might offer some social protection or signal hopeful respect. And some chose names from the Bible, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ruth, Naomi, to cling to the only source of faith they had, even if this too was forced on them. In many other cases, names weren't chosen at all. They were assigned to them by local clerks or written down by officials during registration, once again showing the lack of respect for them, enslaved or free. In the end, whether they chose a name or had one assigned to them, Black Americans still had to navigate a system that refused to fully see them as free or equal. Even this first step, having a name on paper, showed that freedom came with limits, and that the struggle to define themselves was only just beginning. And when they finally did begin to truly name themselves with creativity and pride, those names, like everything else they created, were met with judgment. Judgment that would go on to shape how they were hired, where they could live, and how they were treated in every part of American life. The story of Black American names didn't stop at emancipation. In fact, it kept evolving, turning into something deeply creative and uniquely their own. During the 1960s and 70s, in the middle of the civil rights and Black Power movements, Many Black Americans began to move away from traditional Anglo-American names. It wasn't just about sounding different, it was about reclaiming a sense of self in a country that had long tried to define them. Movements like the Nation of Islam popularized Arabic and Islamic-inspired names, Jamal, Malik, Aisha, even among families who weren't Muslim. These names signaled dignity, strength, and cultural pride. Around the same time, a new style of naming emerged. Creative spellings, invented combinations, and the use of letters rarely seen in English names, especially the letter Q, adding prefixes like la, di, or suffixes like isha or ik, created names that were unmistakably Black. The letter Q, often combined with U or standing out in unexpected ways, became a marker of uniqueness, a quiet refusal to blend in. It was a way to say we define ourselves. We choose what we will be called. We create our own legacy. Like so many things Black Americans have built, from music to style to language, naming became a space to transform pain and restriction into pride and creativity. But unfortunately, with that pride came judgment and discrimination. Even today, a name can shape how someone is seen before they ever open their mouth. Studies have shown that job applicants with names perceived as Black, like Jamal, Aaliyah, or Deshawn, get fewer interview callbacks, even with identical qualifications. Some Black-coded names can still influence first impressions, job opportunities, and even where someone is allowed to live, affecting loan approvals, rental applications, and access to certain neighborhoods. In America, a name can determine which doors stay open and which ones never open at all. And then there's, once again, Black names being the object of ridicule. For decades, certain Black names have been used as punchlines. They've been ridiculed in classrooms, workplaces, and on TV. But these names are not mistakes or jokes. They are part of a long tradition of creating new identity within a system that still limits it. Even with these risks, many Black Americans choose unique names to express identity and pride. Knowing those choices can shape how they're treated, it's a part of their resilience. Names like Queen, Caesar, and Venus sounded grand, but they were never meant to honor. They were meant to mock, to entertain enslavers, and to remind the enslaved of their lack of power. These names looked extravagant on paper, but in reality, they covered lives defined by violence and control. Today, they remain in records as evidence of that cruelty and of the long history of using names to strip people of dignity instead of giving it. That is the true story behind these so-called royal and godlike names. But, as we always do, we survived it and flipped it, showing our constant and eternal resilience. So, lurkers, what do you think? Have you ever wondered why the enslaved people had interesting names? Did you know the history? Do you have a unique name that you're proud of? Let me know down below.